Church is not just a building or a place for us to gather over the weekends. Church is not about the nuts and the bolts, not about bright lights, music, or personalities.
Alongside Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth welcoming you back to America's Forum. Miranda, that was part of a church video for the City Harvest Church in Singapore.
That same church is going through some very hard times. The church's founder, Kong Hee, is on trial in what some are calling a religious freedom test case.
Joining us now to talk more about this story and give us more on the story, A.R. Bernard, the founder, senior pastor, and CEO of Christian Cultural Center. Pastor Bernard, we thank you for joining us from Newsmax, New York.
My pleasure to be with you this morning.
And Pastor, as I understand it, you are a supporter of Kong Hee, the City Harvest Church, facing corruption charges. What can you tell us about his situation?
Well, you know, it's a unique situation in that it's really testing religious freedom in the country of Singapore. Of course, here in the United States, churches start filming and do movies and have their own record labels and gospel, but that is a strange thing in the country of Singapore when it comes to what they call charitable organizations engaging in that kind of activity. For them, it's far from their original purpose. So Kong Hee tested that, not intentionally, it turned out that way, and as a result of how it was done, he was accused because there were 13 people who filed complaints against him, and these are former church members and leaders, that he was engaged in corruption. Of course, this created a situation for the government to investigate him. It's been 4.5 years. They haven't really found anything to show that he was guilty of enormment in any way, not he or his wife. But the case continues. According to the judge, it's supposed to wrap up in the end of June.
Mr. Bernard, you have been reported as saying that you believe that Mr. Kong has made a few mistakes in judgment. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I mean, and I have to be careful here not to say anything that will undermine the trial because it's still in process. But I think he could have been a little wiser in how he handled his attempts to break his wife into the American music industry. She was very popular in Asia, did very, very well, and he felt that the next step would be to break her out into the American music scene. And he was able to get a contract with Sony, but how he developed that relationship was not too wise.
Well, Pastor Bernard, we saw a headline from one of the British newspapers saying that that Pastor Hee spent some $40 million trying to get his wife into the American music scene. For every fellowship of faith, is it important to have outside independent accountants to monitor where church funds are going?
I think it's very, very important. We should be held accountable and held to a higher standard. Unfortunately, there was not this type of accounting set up for what was going on in the United States, even though the City Harvest Church did have an outside accountant monitoring everything who gave approval and sign off on the actions that were taken through the process.
You have been very supportive of Mr. Kong. Why is that?
Well, I've been working with him and churches in Asia for the last 15 years. My first trip was in 1999, where we were introduced to his ministry. And at that time, he had about 3,000 members. And he was intrigued by our model here in New York, in the United States, of bringing Christ to the culture and really building relationships within social institutions and doing things in the marketplace within the parameters of our purpose statement. So we built that relationship, started building the church. He started to create social service programs, which were not common in Singapore, which is still a young nation. They celebrate their 50th anniversary this year. So he was bringing in social programs for the elderly, educational programs, healthcare programs, And this created quite a stir. And when you have a congregation that grows to over 30,000 people, which is larger than the ruling political party, I'm sure that people have some concerns.
Pastor Bernard, we've got about 2.5 minutes left in this particular portion of our program, and so if I could, I'd like to change subjects and get your take on what is transpiring now in the state of Alabama. Right now it appears a showdown there between the state and a federal ruling making same-sex marriage legal. Many counties, under the instruction of the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, are refusing to issue marriage licenses. What do you think of that point of view taken in that order from the Chief Justice of the state of Alabama, and where do you stand on the whole question of gay marriage?
Well, I will tell you that when it comes to same-sex marriage as a civil right, and if we define civil right as those rights that allow a citizen of a nation to be involved in full participation in the social and political life of that society, then I will say that they have grounds to fight for that kind of right. Personally, as a person of faith who adheres to a particular moral standard of conduct, I can't agree with it. But I understand that this is part of the struggle in the United States and around the world, because there are many nations that have made same-sex marriage nationally legal. So the resistance that is coming and the pushback, I think it's all part of a process that really speaks of an inevitability that will take place in the United States. We're at 37 states where it's legal, and they're continuing to push that agenda.
And mindful of that, Pastor, and so many topics in the news for people of faith, sir, we hope that you will come back and visit us again in the future, as you have a vibrant ministry there in New York City. Again, our guest, A.R. Bernard, the founder, senior pastor, and chief executive officer of the Christian Cultural Center. Sir, we thank you for your time as you joined us from New York City. There is much more to talk about during this final hour of America's Forum, including genuine reality television, the Benham brothers, who are quite outspoken in terms of their traditional faith. They had their program canceled by HGTV, but they will join us for what I billed earlier as genuine reality television, where the courage of their convictions led to that cancellation, but they're unbowed and unashamed, and they will join us in just a while. Right now, we step aside for this Newsmax Now update.